Hi. Today we're going to talk about keystone species and trophic cascades. So with keystone species, basically what we're talking about is if we look at an ecosystem, we often find there's several different species that play an enormously large role in maintaining the ecosystem in its current structure. So think of it this way. Every organism is important in its ecosystem. However, there's certain ones that if you remove them, it changes the character of the ecosystem completely. It's not just that the one is missing, it's just that everything about it is different. It even looks different afterwards. I mean, it often changes the appearance of the ecosystem. So let's just take a look at what keystone species could be. Okay, so generally speaking, we find that keystone species, these super important ones in a given ecosystem, come down to one of four different roles that they play. They could be predators, they could be prey items, they could be what we call engineers, which is sort of a loose term, but basically organisms that build things, and then a mutualist. Let's start with predators. Okay, so the thing about predators, and we're usually talking about an apex predator, like a wolf or a shark or a lion. So they do two things in particular. All right, so they obviously they eat prey items that often herbivores. But what they do is they keep the population of the organisms below them down through predation, but they also change the behavior of those other organisms, making them a little bit less aggressive in their feeding behaviors. And this can, as we're going to see in the next part of this, when we talk about trophic cascades, can have a lot of impact on other organisms in the ecosystem. So, for instance, if you have lions or wolves, then it changes the behavior of the deers and the elk, so they eat less often and they are a little more skittish, and as a result, certain plant species are better able to grow, which produces habitat for other organisms, and the biodiversity of the ecosystem is much richer. Uh, Sharks that patrol the edge of reef keep not large, but fairly large fish like, say, barracuda. They make them less aggressive, which allows other smaller fish to flourish. So we find that there's certain species that are of predators that their presence influences the behavior and abundance of organisms below them, and that in turn changes the entire dynamic of the ecosystem. Now, prey species. Basically, there's certain species of prey items that are so important in their ecosystem that without them, you couldn't have that ecosystem. So, for instance, in the African savanna, we have wildebeest, the Great Migration. So many predators rely on the wildebeest, and those wildebeest in turn play a large role in maintaining the habitat and the way it is through feeding. Another important one is krill, which are little small zooplankton type shrimp-like creatures that are often form the basis of the food chain for marine ecosystems, and without them, there just isn't an ecosystem. So there are times when you have these prey species that are incredibly important in the role they play in the ecosystem. There's other ones that if they're there, they're there. You eat them, you don't. It's not a big deal. But the keystone prey items are the ones that form the basis for an ecosystem. Engineers are organisms that build things, and in building those things, they influence the ecosystem. The classic example of this would be a beaver. So beavers build dams, and these dams provide them with shelter, and it causes willows to grow on the banks, which they like to eat. And so when they're present, their dams take these little streams and turn them into ponds, which then in turn serve as habitat for all kinds of bird species, mammal species, fish species. So inadvertently, just by beavers being beavers, they change the ecosystem in a way that provides the majority of the habitat that's found there. Another thing would be like termite mounds in Africa and Australia. Play an important role in providing habitat and food for a lot of other things. It's usually these are more in a grassland to desert type environment. Elephants, they tend to knock down trees and keep savanna from becoming scrubland. And then coral, obviously, just its presence provides all kinds of habitat for other organisms. So these are ones that by building things, they provide habitat for other creatures. And then we have mutualists. So a mutualist is basically an organism that is engaged in a symbiotic relationship with another species. And a classic one of these, usually we're talking about here, are pollinators. So flowering plants, which are the dominant terrestrial plant forms, they require usually an organism to help them pollinate. Some of them can do it through the wind, but most of them require another species to transfer their pollen, the male sex cells, from one plant to another. So if you don't have bees, you don't have trees, basically. And this is actually a problem. There's things called uh, what was it? I think it's called colony collapse syndrome, where the bee species are dying out, and it's producing a problem for the ecosystems in which these bees normally operate. Uh, so those are the four different types of keystone species that we'd have. Now let's talk about trophic cascades. So a trophic cascade is a really phenomenal idea here. So the idea is that there are certain organisms that if you remove them, then it changes the relative abundance of species with which they interact. And then when you change that, the numbers of those species, it causes a change in another species and so on. So you get this cascade of effects. You change one of them, and it changes a lot more. So a classic example of this is in Yellowstone National Park in the United States. People killed off the wolves. Well, when they killed off the wolves, it turns out the wolves ate elk and deer. And so, because they are a keystone species. Now, when you take these predators out, suddenly the elk and the deer aren't afraid anymore. They eat a lot. They're not afraid to go out. So they really ate down the plant population, including willows. And then this in turn made it difficult for beaver to have a habitat. So the beavers quit building beaver dams, and that completely changed the entire habitat of the ecosystem. So removing one species caused this cascade of effects. So here's a classic example of how to look at it. So before, we have a wolf, it eats the deers, and the deers eat the trees. And unlike a food web diagram, what we do here is the arrows indicate the direction of effect, not the movement of energy, but who's putting an effect on who. So if I remove the wolves, now I get this trophic cascade because suddenly there's more deer and elk. And if there's more deer and elk, then there's less of these trees. Now, this idea was first noticed in the Aleutian Islands. The guy was scuba diving, and what he noticed is that there were places where if you had this one species of starfish in a nearshore ecosystem, there was a lot of biodiversity. But what happens is if you take these away, then one species overwhelms all the others, and all you get is mussels. And so you have a total lack of biodiversity by the removal of one species. So removing one species caused this cascading effect that just led to this. So here's a graph I think is kind of interesting. So basically what this researcher did is he took different regions of shoreline, left the starfish in certain areas as a control. So this is Pisaster. This is the starfish that eats mussels. And then removed them from another one. And what they found was, as the years went by, the number of species that were present plummeted in the area that didn't have the starfish. So the starfish had this effect on the rest of the ecosystem by holding down the population of one species, and in this case, the mussels. And so the biodiversity was very high when that one was present, and it plummeted when it was gone. So that makes this starfish a keystone species, but it also led to this trophic cascade. So what's fun with trophic cascades is to make a diagram of them. So if we make a diagram, it goes like this. The predator, puts an effect on the herbivore, which puts an effect on the producer. So the arrows are showing who's affecting who. Okay. Now what happens is we're going to use solid lines to represent what we call a direct effect. A direct effect means that one species is directly interacting with another. It's eating the other one, or it's building habitat for another one, or it's providing nutrients for the other one. So we use solid lines to represent that. A positive sign next to it would indicate that having one species causes an increase in the other species. So if species A is present and I put a plus sign, it means the presence of species A makes more of species B. So more bees means more trees. So it'd be a positive effect. A negative sign means that more of one means less of the other. So more wolves means less deer. So that would be a negative sign. So wolf has a direct effect because it eats elk. It's a negative sign because more wolves means less elk. Now, elk eat willows, And the more elk you have, the less willows you have. So more of these means less of those, so it's a negative sign. So this is basically how it would look prior to triggering the cascade. Now, we can also talk about what's called an indirect effect, and this is what makes it interesting, because this allows us to see unintended consequences that we might not understand why they're happening without drawing a trophic cascade diagram. So an indirect effect would mean one species doesn't, like for instance, the wolf doesn't do anything to the willows, but it does have an effect on the willows. So we use dashed lines to represent these indirect effects. And again, a plus sign means more of one gives you more of the other, and a negative sign means more of one species gives you less of the other, but it's an indirect effect. So let's look at what I'm talking about here. So remember, the wolf has a direct negative effect on the elk, because more wolves means less elk. And an elk has a direct solid line negative effect on the willows, because elk eat willows, and the more elk you have, the less willows you have. But the indirect effect, which you could show with a dotted line, would be positive. What this means is if I have more wolves, I will have more willows, because I will have less elk. So that's the idea of a trophic cascade. Now, if you take away the wolves, then what's going to happen is, since more wolves means less willows, if you take away the wolves, less wolves means less willows, because it's a positive indirect effect. And we can keep this going. So let's just try this. The wolf eats the elk eats the willows. Now, willows have a direct positive effect on beavers, because the more willow trees there are, the more beavers you can have building dams. And the more beavers you have, the more fish you can have. So these are positive effects. More beavers make more dams, which makes more fish. More willows means more material for building dams, so this engineered keystone species can build their habitat. So now let's just see what happens here. So if I take away, well, first of all, let's just say that the wolf has an indirect effect on fish that is positive, meaning more wolves are going to produce more fish in this ecosystem. Why? Because more wolves means less elk means more willows means more beavers means more fish. So therefore, more wolves, more fish. That's what we mean by a trophic cascade. And then what we could do is we say, well, if I take the wolf out, less wolves means more elk, because it's a negative. More elk will mean less willows, because it's a negative effect. Less willows will mean less beavers, because it's a positive effect. Less beavers will make less fish. So by removing the wolves from an ecosystem, we ended up inadvertently removing the fish. So that's trophic cascades for you. We'll give you some examples to work on in class. See you in class soon.